All right. I'm Chris Kanish. I'm the Executive Director of the 11th Ward IPO, an organization here in the 11th Ward that is trying to build a more equitable and more representative and more effective local government. And one of the most important things that is definitely at the top of our minds now is the ward redistricting that's going to happen. So we, along with Change Illinois, as well as the 25th Ward IPO and the 48th Ward Neighbors for Justice, would like to hand it over to Debbie and Lily to give us this presentation. So please take it away.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Debbie. I am a, concerned Chicago resident and also long-time resident in Bridgeport. Was born and raised basically in the Bridgeport neighborhood. So shout out to 11th Ward IPO for doing this. But I live on the near South Side and born and raised here. So I am very interested in kind of like the politics that goes on in this area and what we can do in terms of policy change. And I'm going to turn it over to Lily.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Lily Scales. I'm the Advocacy Director at Change Illinois. I've been with the organization for about a year and a half, really working on redistricting efforts at the state level and now at the city level. Also a concerned resident of the city of Chicago, a resident of the 25th Ward, born and raised in Chicago, went to school in Ohio, came back and realized that Chicago is a very segregated city. As I left at the age of 18 and came back, I got so charged up to want to be engaged in a process that included all of communities. And so this is where I landed after many, many years of my political learning. So before we begin, I want to explain the process in case no one knows really about the redistricting process. I always like to assume like redistricting and the redistricting process isn't like a sexy term. And people are like, yes, I can't wait to talk about redistricting. And so a lot of the process is not really known. And so hopefully this slide is able to provide you with a simplified process of the redistricting or the remap process of the city of Chicago. So the first process, or the first step in the process, is for an ordinance to be submitted to the city clerk detailing the exact ward boundaries. In the past, the detailings of ward boundaries haven't been exactly accurate, yet ward maps still went through and were voted on by aldermen. After the ordinance is submitted, then the city council votes on the ordinance. And without 41 votes, 10 aldermen can submit an alternative map and essentially provide a competing map that would lead to a referendum. So essentially, 41 aldermen have to be in support of a map before they vote on it. And then 3, the ward map takes effect in the next municipal election. And I have an asterisk there saying pending litigation. And the reason I say that is because through lots of research, really there's been a litigation to every redistricting process, almost in every decade since the 1970s. The one that I point out too often is that in 1990, the map process led to a 6-year court case costing taxpayers, City of Chicago residents, nearly $20 million. So as we go through the presentation and you are asking yourself, well, why should we care about redistricting? Why should I be involved? Think about that hefty number that because of those litigations, because of maps not being fairly drawn, we end up paying the brunt of that. The timeline remains December 1st, 2021 is when the map has to be approved. We added winter 2020 dates as well as spring 2021 dates. And the reason that they're pending really is because it's all contingent on census numbers and how the states are receiving apportionment counts as well as data needed for redistricting. And so I know that us as an organization, we keep track of census news and trying to figure out what is going to be the date that the states do receive population count. And at the moment, every single day there's something different that comes out. But for Chicagoans, the date remains December 1st, 2021 is when City Council approves the map under state statute. And we have some time for those maps to take into effect. They take into effect the next municipal election, which is February 28th of 2023.
So when drawing maps, it can go really well and then it can go really poorly. There's this term called gerrymandering where folks, especially elected officials and people who have power to dictate this process, manipulate the boundaries so that it favors a certain party or a certain class. And so wards are actually drawn to help the incumbent stay in office, versus they could also be used for best representation of people in communities. And this is a reason why there are this like high number of uncompetitive elections. So maybe you'll see elections after elections where it's only one person or maybe two people that compete for a certain seat, whether that's for alderman or for state district or for state senate or even for Congress. And so how do we look at this in a way that actually could possibly be fair? So if you look at the graphic to the right, so let's just say there's 50 precincts or 50 districts that could be divided up. So if there's 60% that's blue, not political representation colors, 60% blue and 40% red, you can draw it so that it becomes 20-20-20, but how do you actually draw it in a way that actually could mean that it represents this like majority of blue? So to the right, there is you divide it into 5 equally, and where it does favor the blue. But if you look at the other one more right to it, you'll see that actually, depending on how you actually draw these lines, that it could actually mean the minority becomes the majority. And so gerrymandering overall was this term that was kind of created by some that I guess it's kind of like this guy was drawing was this salamander or district, and it became, this guy was named Jerry, and so it became gerrymandering as a term to describe how actually it really depends on the line that gets ultimately drawn, and that it then becomes favorable or unfavorable to a certain class or a race or a community. And so this is where things can go wrong, especially when there's no representation. So if we look at Chicago and you look at kind of the census groups by race, you'll see that this is like every other map in Chicago, so this is not a surprise to a lot of people, where the north side is predominantly white, and then kind of the south and west side is predominantly black, followed by little pockets of Hispanic, including the industrial corridor, and then there's some pockets of Asian. Specifically around Uptown, Chinatown, Westridge. So if you look at these dots, actually, we can actually see that we are a city that's hyper segregated, but it is actually disenfranchisement by design, where folks are drawing lines, historically have drawn lines in a way that continues to segregate the city. So this map can actually be seen on the New York Times website, but it is a map that is very similar to our other map in Chicago. So this is just to show how segregation actually operates and continues to operate in Chicago. So why is community input important? So most people actually are not part of any redistricting process. It is a good process to allow more community representation, where people do have a say in how their maps get drawn, especially when these maps are in place every 10 years following the census. So maps could be more reflective of a community if people had more say in it. Generally, it's a process where elected officials and city council folks ultimately decide on how these maps get drawn. Sometimes sometimes some elected officials kind of get asked input from residents, including like a survey or a town hall, but then sometimes it's usually not incorporated into how the maps actually get drawn. So what we think should happen is that it should include more community inputs in a process where people do get stuck with a map that lasts every 10 years.
So the disenfranchisement by design, really, that was a quote that was from a resident of the Englewood community. His name is Rodney Johnson, who's involved in a lot of our collaborative working groups. And he's quoted it saying that. And when he said that, it was a statement that you're like, yeah, that makes sense. Of course, it was disenfranchisement by design, right? Wards are manipulated in ways to keep certain people in power and other people not in power. And when you look at communities like Englewood that are broken up into 6 different wards, you begin to realize, why has this been done that way? And can our 50 wards be more reflective of our 77 community areas? And so when you begin to think about, well, what is my community boundary? What does it look like? How do I relate within my own community? Is it reflective in the 50 wards? And right now, the community areas are split across the multiple wards, about 89% of them. And so when we present the tool of how you can be engaged and show and answer some questions that really help you reflect, how do you define your community, whether that's through ethnicity, language, cultural identity, keep this in mind about your wards being representative across the community areas.
So what happens actually in communities that across the city when they're split? There are plenty of examples of how this has been done historically. But this past redistricting, we've actually seen a lot of neighborhoods that we love get split up into many different wards. So then they become represented by multiple aldermen or alderwomen. And some people are like, well, that's great. You have multiple people to represent you. But actually, then you are vying for 2 people's attention, or 3 people, or 4, sometimes 7 people's attention. And so because the proportion of people that they then have to become your constituent of is such a small number, it's often that they just are like, well, we don't really have to do this because you don't influence my vote. So there are primarily two elected officials, 2 aldermen representing Chinatown, that's split by the business district, and it's split by more of the residential piece. But then there's also Uptown is seeing very similar, where there is 3 aldermen, Avondale, Lakeview, Little Village has 5, and then Englewood 6. Englewood has a lot, but it's also on par with Back of the Yards and Logan Square, which has 7. So the number of wards and how elected officials get to draw these kind of like smaller boundaries then actually have an impact on what communities get to advocate or not advocate for.
And I'll also add to Debbie's point about the examples of split neighborhoods. We think about Rodney's quote again, disenfranchisement by design. Think about Chinatown, for those of you on the call who live in the 25th ward like myself. You think about Chinatown as a community and you wonder, why is the business portion of Chinatown in the 25th ward and the community portion of Chinatown in the 11th ward? You look at Little Village. And why is it split up in 5 wards? You look at Englewood, that has statistically some of the highest crime rates in the city of Chicago, next to Austin. Why are they split up in 5 wards? And when Debbie's going to show the next slide once she gets to it, how wards that are cut up in multiple communities that are cut up in multiple wards have higher rates of violence, higher rates of disenfranchisement and poverty levels, and we begin to think about, why has this been manipulated? And I know a question came in about political considerations for individual aldermen. When you look at wards that have maintained their power and their consistency, you look at aldermen that have been in office for decades, right? So you look at, let's take Alderman Burke's ward, for example. There's a specific, he was able to choose his voters, no matter how his ward boundaries had changed as far as representation and the makeup of his constituents. But when you end up gerrymandering, so manipulating ward boundaries to ensure that you protect your incumbency, then you end up with wards and you end up with aldermen who are indicted on 14 federal charges and are still aldermen.
So this is going to be like a gift where you get to see how this map changes over time from 1961 to 2015. But because we're showing this because Bridgeport is part of this map. This is done by Professor Vargas from U Chicago, where we're looking at redistricting at 7 chosen affluent community neighborhoods. So take a look at how the lines have been drawn for Bridgeport and all these other neighborhoods versus the rest of the city. So it's like 50 years of very little change. So there's another map, which is redistricting in high crime neighborhoods, where those neighborhoods are changing all the time in the same time period. And so I think that's something that we really need to consider is when we divide along class lines, when we divide along other lines, that it becomes very apparent why things are the way they are in terms of societal issues.
If I can add, Debbie, Dr. Vargas's information on that short clip, and then also showing neighborhoods like Little Village and Austin, it really goes to point out that if you have political stabilization, then you stabilize communities, and the communities that end up benefiting from the stabilization are the ones that are shown here. And so I think we're all frustrated and all fed up with the same map of Chicago being the same map of Chicago. So hopefully we can get you all engaged to do something about changing that.
So we're going to show a couple more examples, and Lily will chime in with what happens actually in something that actually really happened in this past redistricting, which is highlighting the first and second wards. And this goes back to a question that was in the chat about how politics actually play a role in this. The first ward had part of actually Chinatown way back, but also has parts of downtown. But because of the last alderman and the clashes they were having with the last mayor, a lot of how that map got drawn was very political, which forced other maps to be just as political. And for example, the first ward really looks kind of like this human that's like all over the place, kind of like jumping around. Then there's the second ward that everyone knows as the lobster. It actually has really long-term effects, not only for the communities that are being impacted, but by the surrounding communities, because they're also facing very similar issues or challenges just because of politics.
So that the Crab ward, for those of you who are familiar with Ward 2, it essentially has shifted and jumped more west throughout the decades. And for those of you who have lived in Chicago for quite some time, will know that Alderman Fioretti essentially was drawn out of his own ward for Ward 2. Feel free to look up Ward 2 and see the manipulation of that map and think about political considerations when you have when essentially maps can be drawn to map out aldermen from running again in those wards.
So just a little bit about more of the history of Chicago and how we even have 50 wards. So at some point in Chicago, we had 70 aldermen, and it was 35 wards. Some people call it fiefdoms because they managed like a whole empire when it's actually a neighborhood. So one of the most interesting things is actually Chicago is the third most populous city, but yet New York, which is the top most populous city in the US, only actually has 51 city council members. So in terms of population size and who gets represented, we actually have way more than what is proportional to other major cities. So that also gives us a lot of other concerns that are very tied to policy and politics. So that's just something to keep in mind. And I also want to highlight that LA is the second most populous city, and they only have 15 council members. So it's really, at the end of the day, this is all like influence and power and how politics play a role in that.
Really quickly, Debbie, just wanted to add on the 50 wards, fiefdoms, that I think before we begin to imagine what a city of Chicago could look like with not having 50 wards, just so that everyone has a better understanding that it's a requirement by state law. There will always, I shouldn't say always, there will be 50 wards in any near future, and any changes to whether that makes sense for the city of Chicago, and understanding that you have alders that are supposed to hold your community of interest at heart, and to really advocate for those communities, that will maintain 50 wards for any foreseeable future, because it's our state law there. But should we go down 15? Who knows? Does that make sense? I'm not sure, because I think if you ask, depending on if you ask constituents that live in other cities, whether they feel like they have access to their city council members the way that maybe we do or not, maybe a reason to think about, well, does 50 make sense? But in the current future, because it's state law, we will have 50 wards.
So what we advocate for, and what we think would be very beneficial for this new remap to be, and how it gets drawn, is actually getting authentic and transparent community input in a way that is actually equitable, that isn't just going to people who already have power and money, and having them answer the question, who gets to be in this ward, who doesn't. And really, because ultimately it affects all of us. It affects our education, our safety, our perception of safety, our perception of crime, and representation. So if people aren't at the table, they just then are stuck with maps that aren't representing their own interests and representing interests of other people. So what happens when gerrymandering actually occurs is it actually hurts communities of color the most. And we see this repeatedly through some examples that we've shown today, but there has been a lot of research that shows that Black and brown communities, minority communities are often the ones that have the least amount of resources, mostly because elected officials aren't advocating on their behalf. So lack of voter choice at a ballot box, that's another big thing, because then it becomes the same old people who have been in power for a long time, remains in power. And then this then perpetuates this cycle of unaccountable elected officials. And people then ultimately continue to get reelected when they're not representing their communities. And the biggest thing is really politicians are choosing their own voters, especially maybe they're like bringing in a senior facility in their ward, but not a low income housing unit. So it's like important to really figure out where these lines get drawn, and how many people will be impacted, and who gets to be at the table.
Right. Who really benefits from that process? Because we're talking about the city level and how community has been included in that process outside of public comment. There have been coalition tables that were advocating for their communities to be drawn within specific ward boundaries, and to ensure that their communities weren't broken up. But when you have electeds who are drawing ward boundaries behind closed doors and cutting deals behind closed doors, you end up seeing the effects of that process in maps that, mind you, we are stuck with for a decade. So we can't say like, we'll get them next year, because it doesn't happen next year. It's a decade process of redistricting. So redistricting that's not the bad part, right? The redistricting process is required. It happens every 10 years after the census across every municipality across the country. It's when sticky little fingers get in the process and start manipulating these boundaries that end up negatively impacting and affecting people who have been disenfranchised and marginalized. So we're now aware, and I think what we end up seeing across the country is extreme partisan gerrymandering, and I think people end up thinking about gerrymandering being nefarious in states that are red, but we all live in Illinois. Illinois is a blue state. We have a supermajority of Democrats, and Illinois is also rated the #1 most corrupt state in the country. Chicago's rated, I think, 1 or 2 most corrupt city in the country. And I think all of you who are watching or listening can understand that even someone with the letter D next to their name may not have the best interest of their communities. When you have representatives and aldermen and senators that are being indicted on multiple FBI charges, these are the people that are in charge of drawing the maps for 10 years.
So when we draw maps, there are 3 ways to consider communities of interest. One, typically, map drawers do not live in these communities, the ones that we're talking about, and they may ignore communities of interest, or they are just not aware of how people see their own communities. And so maybe demographically, or maybe somehow the data gets manipulated in a way that it feels like that's right, how the lines should be drawn. But map makers or map drawers actually have a lot of power in terms of then they are defining the communities of interest. And when those communities are defined, map makers actually have a chance to actually listen and respect input. And if that actually happens, so we need to be educating communities themselves, need to be educating people who will eventually become map drawers in these cases where they're looking at demographics, they're looking at other information to figure out how lines can get drawn. But usually, because they are removed from these communities, they don't really have the best knowledge or the interest of folks in mind. And these are folks who are potentially maybe well-intentioned, but they just don't necessarily know all the ins and outs of a community.
So how can you be engaged in a process that ensures that community of interest are included in the maps? I want to be really clear, like, you're not expected to be demographers or experts in cutting up maps and determining the equal populations among the wards. The communities of interest maps really are for people to select how they define their community. So if let's take, for example, I live in Pilsen, and I generally define my own community by cultural and language identity. And so when I would go and draw my community of interest, I will select census blocks that you'll be able to see in the map once I share my screen with you and go through it, where you can begin selecting what are the census blocks that define your community. So I know in Pilsen, there's some hard lines, like what's considered Pilsen and what's not considered Pilsen. And so you get to determine within your ward boundaries where that should stop or not. And the data that gets used by drawing the community of interest maps is a way that you can use that data to advocate to your alderman, to call your alderman, to say and to ask really if they are believe in a process that is transparent, and if they believe in a process that includes community input. Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen and walk through the tool with you. So when you go to the link, we draw the lines in Representable, and just to give you some background, Representable is a tool that is coming out of the Princeton Gerrymandering project. So this is a new tool that could align with other tools, folks who are well versed in community map drawing, like Districtor, that you can use this data and input it into an actual map drawing tool. So when you get to the website, you'll be able to see information about Representable, who they are. And on the very bottom here, you'll see the campaign Redraw the Lines that's organized by Change Illinois, which is the organization that I work for. And then you scroll to the bottom, you'll get a sense of what redistricting looks at the state level and what the criteria for the state level is. You'll see there it has to abide by the Federal Voting Rights Act. So does the city. It has to be substantially equal in population. Same for the city, and compact is same for the city as well. So you go to the very bottom here and it says Draw My Community. You click on that. You'll end up having to log in or sign up. So I'm going to click sign up. You end up putting your email, your password, and then once you once you create an account, you'll end up seeing the map where you are able to plug in your information. Let me share a different screen here. So plug in, you'll get to this next page, which is your name. I just put in our address for our downtown just as an example. You'll go to the next slide. It'll define communities of interest to you, for you, I apologize. So a community of interest can include your neighborhood that you live in, or the people that you identify with, or a local group that's brought you together. You'll go to the next slide. You'll be asked about what in your communities unite you, and you do have to add some information in one of the categories. So if it's community services, I'm just going to put random letters to move us to the next one. You'll name your community, and then you'll get to this map here. So I'm going to put in, you can also, you can put in your full address, or you can put in a specific zip code, and it'll zoom in to the map. And then you can begin clicking. These are actually census blocks. You don't need to know the census block number or any specifics on that. But if you say, all right, this is generally where I define my community. Like I said, this is our offices. So I'm going to say, you know, this, I'm going to select this community, this community, this community, this community. Here, I'm going to select maybe Pierre, sure. Okay, so I've selected my community of interest. Click save, and you're going to get to this portion here where essentially you do have to click for privacy in terms of use to ensure that you're not a robot and there is nothing nefarious going on with, you know, bots and whatnot. So you click that, say you're not a robot. If you are not a robot, submit, and then you'll end up getting a message that says congratulations here, and then you can export your PDF or your GeoJSON file, and then that's the file, that's the data that you could use on other map tools like Maptitude or Dave's Redistricting or Districtor, like I mentioned, that overlays your community of interest to a map drawing tool. You can also export your PDF and send it to your alderman and say, you know, I know this year is the redistricting year. I want to make sure that my community, as I defined it, stays within this community of interest. I can stay with y'all for a few more minutes, and then I can pass it on to Debbie, who is wonderful, and thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this conversation. We'll also include links and contact information for myself and for Debbie, but I'm happy to take any kind of questions. Take any questions about the process. I know my computer, you guys. Trust.
Yeah, so we do have a few questions coming in from the chat, and we were trying to handle them there, but I think it'd be better for us to go over them as just part of a quick discussion here. So one question that came up is, who historically are the drawers of the maps? Who are the people that are actually putting lines on maps?
So they end up getting, it depends on who the city council hires. Like I mentioned in the past, it's out of the rules on committee, and they're responsible for the redistricting process. But because we don't know who those hands have been, we don't know. So unless some of you guys find who put their hands to the pen, I will say that in previous iterations of the map drawing, the hands of the pen haven't been accurate. So whatever the ordinance that passed, there have been mistakes in that process. And mind you, the ordinance that are passing are showing ward boundaries by address. I mean, it's not like a 2-page document. This is hundreds of pages of north, south, east, west information on these documents.
One thing we do know is people who are divided, the Department for School is not really that big, but the people who do practice that usually are like, they're not just like one-time folks. They're usually like, this is seasoned for them. So and they might have interest of other folks, and so that's just something to keep in mind. And again, it's like up to who city council either appoints, hires for that process.
Yeah, thanks. So another question from the chat is about what gets sent to referendum if there is a set of 10 dissenting alders who present an alternate map. I'll take a stab at this one. When there is at least one group of 10 who did not vote for the city council map, who do all decide they all want to support a specific other map, then that map, along with the one passed by city council as an ordinance, goes to the public referendum. So as long as there are 10 who say no on one side and can agree on a different map, that's when it goes to public referendum. And one happened in 1992. However, the city council map did win the referendum. That was Richard M. Daley's map that won the day there for the 1990 census.
The Unity map, I forget the name of it, but yes, that's correct. And that's the same process and there have been other maps that have been presented, some by MALDEF, the Urban League, there have been competing maps. But what Chris reiterated is that it gets sent to referendum. So it's whatever the residents of the city of Chicago end up voting on. So depending on how that messaging is provided to folks to vote on that map.
Yeah, and there's a fantastic mention in the chat right there about how the timing is actually very tight. So if there are a group of 10 other alders who want to support an alternate map, they need to kind of be ready to go as soon as city council passes their map, because a 15-day timer starts as soon as that map gets passed, and they need to be ready with their ducks in a row to get that put on the ballot. But then once they have made it in that 15-day deadline, it will eventually go to a public referendum. And I'm not familiar with how long that takes to get set up. I believe it goes to the next municipal election. And so if nothing ridiculous happens, then that would either be, if it was very, very soon, it would be the March primary in 2022. And if it was after that, which could also be possible, it would be the November general election in 2022, where everybody in Illinois will be voting for a complete new slate of state senators, state representatives, and a lot of other positions.
And this process should not be confused with what happens at the state or congressional level. Those are different processes, but also on the same track and timeline.
So we have another really great question from chat. So does representable incorporate the various other lines like the school attendance lines or the police district boundaries?
They do not. And this was a question that was brought up on other campaigns in other states. The reason they didn't include that was they didn't want to have any chance of leading the drawing of community of interest. So it doesn't, but I can ask about a layer that they can, I believe, add afterwards, if that's helpful, but it does not include.
Thanks so much. I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat at the moment. If anybody else had any, please do feel free to sneak them in there. Otherwise, I'd just like to thank our presenters. I'd also like to thank the 25th Ward IPO and the 48th Ward Neighbors for Justice and Change Illinois for all their help in making this event a success. There will be a version of this posted very soon on our YouTube channel. And thank you so much, everybody, for joining tonight.
Thank you, everyone. Please draw your community of interest maps.
Thanks.